Dr. George Tiller, an American abortion provider, was assassinated May 31st, 2009, while serving in his church. He was assassinated because he decided that women were physically, morally, spiritually, and ethically capable of making decisions about their bodies and their lives. At the back of that, Dr. Tiller believed that women were capable of exercising conscience and autonomy. Conscience, autonomy. What do those mean?
For me, conscience is the inner voice that tells you simplistically what is right, what is wrong, but I think in daily life and in what you choose to do with your free will, it's where do I want to stand, who do I want to stand behind, and how do I feel drawn to support people and be in the world is your conscience.
I kind of relate to the notion of conscience kind of in terms of like a magnetic pole. Like we have, our compasses are based on the principle that there's a true north. And no matter which direction you point in a compass with its true north, things that are magnetic will relate to it and orient themselves in that regard. So for me, conscience is more like this inner kind of intrinsic polarization towards what is right and what is good. And for me, it's my true north.
Well, I think for me, conscience is really a collection of values that we imbibe as we are raised, either by our families or school or religion or society, which kind of gives you, as you said, a kind of a moral compass, to tell you differentiating between right and wrong. So it's something which I think it evolves because sometimes there are nuanced situations. It's not always black and white that my conscience tells me this is definitely good and this is definitely bad. So I think for me, it's also a process of evolving consciousness.
It's important to notice that there is a history to the concept of conscience, that at one point in human history, ethics was seen as primarily imposed externally, either by government rulers or religious leaders telling people what was ethical. And conscience comes into existence when people realize that they had the capacity within themselves to think about ethical matters and not necessarily be coerced by external forces. Yeah. So I see a character from Greek tragedy named Antigone, a female character from Greek tragedy, as the first person to apparently discover conscience and act on her own without necessarily trying to please external authorities, whether political or religious.
I mean, that must have been a big revolution when you act on your own conscience and you almost defy the gods and you're defying conventions. I always think of the Stoics as being very exciting because they seem to be the first people to realize that you've got these inner resources which are actually much more important than anything else because everything else outside of you is like fortune, it's fate. Nothing you can do about it, but there is something within you that is your own domain that you can begin to sort of navigate and deal with the clear moral issues of the time.
Mm-hmm. I wonder how, if conscience is internal and it's not necessarily something you're socialized into, our orientation towards what I call the true north. I wonder if I had been born in southern India instead of southern United States, would my conscience and sensibilities be the same?
It's a very interesting question. I mean, I suppose all of us, no matter what our background is, have an inner conversation with ourselves. Otherwise, we'd go crazy if we couldn't reflect on life. But presumably, that conversation takes place in a language that is quite specific.
It's interesting to me, growing up in the South and growing up in the organized church, we called it the black church because the church was so segregated, and so the cultural norms around things stratified by gender, but also by race. So growing up, if you were active in church and participating in the life of the church. If a young woman became pregnant, either if she was unmarried or if she was a teen, when it became clinically evident that she was pregnant, she was forced to discontinue her activities in church. Meanwhile, the young male who might have gotten her pregnant was never asked to do so, and in order for her to be restored, she had to stand up publicly and apologize for having brought shame on the church. I never saw a male have to do that.
Yeah, I see a really basic tension in the history of Christianity on the issue of conscience. Like many of the most important figures in the history of Christianity, St. Paul, St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, and then also Luther and Kant, all emphasize conscience to a great degree. That this seems to be an integral part of the tradition to emphasize conscience on the one hand. And then on the other hand, Christianity's been tempted throughout the ages to stipulate all kinds of rules and regulations, on the laity with respect to what ethics is supposed to be all about. So that on the one hand, they're encouraging conscience, and then on the other, legislating morality for people. And I think that tension is still unresolved.
I don't think we're taught in school about informed conscience and making sure that you understand all of the facts to follow your conscience. So we are told, certainly in a Catholic education when you're younger, there's a tendency towards the Catholic hierarchy knows best. They've done the work for you, so you don't have to. So you almost outsource your conscience to the official church, and they have decided that this is wrong, and this is wrong, and this is the way we live, and you will follow that. And for some people who trust in the Catholic hierarchy and trust in religious authorities, they presume the best of the religious authorities, and they say, well, if you are telling me that this is wrong and this is right, then I believe you, and then I don't need to inform my conscience or examine my conscience. I have got a prescription that makes me good because I'm told that this is good by religious authorities who've done the work for me.
The importance of conscience became apparent to me when I read St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, the two most important thinkers in the history of Catholicism, on the issue of fetal development. Contrary to what many or most people think, the dominant tradition in Western Christianity has been something called delayed hominization, where Augustine and Aquinas and others thought that the fetus was not a person early in pregnancy. And immediately when I learned this, I realized that conscience was going to have to play a significant role in any sort of responsible treatment of the issue of abortion.
I mean, how do we see the relationship between conscience and autonomy? Because often they're used interchangeably, but presumably they have very specific meanings that are quite distinct.
Well, in Catholic teaching, and that hasn't changed since Thomas Aquinas, and we're still taught that in school and in seminary at every Catholic university, we're taught that autonomy is the free will that every human is born with. It's a gift from God, and that conscience is what determines how you use that free will. And then an informed conscience is how you get to the education and the social conditions that enable you to make responsible decisions.
I tend to think of autonomy in a way that's influenced by a philosopher named Immanuel Kant, that it's, on the one hand, thinking on your own, but then also thinking in light of reason and thinking in ways that could be justified in front of other people who are reasonable beings as well.
Yeah. Although, I mean, you could argue that autonomy is more or less, it's not a right, because often today it's kind of perceived as, I got my right to an autonomy. It's a duty, and it's your duty to find yourself and to discover yourself and to discover the moral virtues. So it's through the voyage of discovery that choice-making involves, that you become a good person. In other words, you don't begin life as a good person, you become good through the choices that you make in your everyday life, which I find to be a fantastically exciting way of understanding autonomy.
And so autonomy would mean that you have agency that allows you to act independent of any influence other than what's central to you. And even if you somehow lose a connection with your conscience, you can even act independently of that notion of conscience. And I'm thinking in particular of if we're all made of the same DNA of both Martin Luther King and Adolf Hitler, their agency or their autonomy allowed them to act in ways independent, one acting in response to conscience and one appearing to act independent of conscience.
Right.
And I suppose what we're saying is that autonomy does not give you any guarantees that the direction that you move in will necessarily be a positive one. But for all that, it's still important to have that freedom to make choices, because it's through that the best of humanity is discovered. And just because in certain circumstances it has destructive or negative consequences would not be an argument against that.
Yeah, and we have to believe that everyone has moral agency, because the alternative is that we are just a puppet of some divine force. And our teaching doesn't support that. Our teaching in the Catholic Church is firmly that we have, every single one of us has moral agency. And we might not like the way people use their freedom sometimes, but everyone has it, and we need to defend it. I
think it's important not to underemphasize the enemies of autonomy, that in some ways they have the upper hand. So I think if you really did think that human beings were determined in leading the lives that they lead, due to whatever sort of background, whether genetic or social or religious, you're going to have a tendency to trivialize or deny autonomy altogether. So I think people who want to defend autonomy have to confront that sort of opposition.
Now, we're talking about autonomy in a very positive kind of a way, but for most of us, most of the time, autonomy is a very scary and dangerous idea. I mean, imagine you kind of stepping out and testing yourself in circumstances not of your own making. It's a very difficult thing to do. And there's a very lovely little kind of article that Immanuel Kant wrote called What is Enlightenment? And basically what Immanuel Kant says there is that enlightenment is our ability to overcome our immaturity or our fear of thinking for ourselves.
A lot of, sound-minded adult human beings have trouble exercising their autonomy and would prefer to have somebody else, either religious leaders or political leaders or people in an aggressive advertising industry, think for them so that they don't grow into their autonomy.
But sometimes it seems as though people actually want someone to tell them what to do. Because you find even now, particularly, in countries like India, but elsewhere as well, people voluntarily join cults. They want to follow someone who tells them what to do. So you would really wonder what is it that prevents them from asserting their own autonomy and saying, no, I'm going to do this because this is what I believe in, as opposed to saying, a guru or a swami is telling us to do this, therefore it is good.
Teenagers are notorious for, falling victim to peer pressure. I'm always surprised at how many sound-minded adults, do the same sort of thing, that they feel that they, have to buy into the ideals of, compulsively consuming commodity fetishist culture. And then before you know it, they're often running in a lifestyle where their autonomy is thwarted. So there are all kinds of commercial pressures on people to, not really think on their own.
And it seems to me that it's that fear of putting yourself on the line that very often, even in a very modern society, leads people to, almost kind of follow the latter's voice, kind of defer to people who are really just kind of charlatans rather than making things for themselves.
Yeah.
It's probably also not wanting to suffer the consequences of your choice and then accepting that you were to blame if the choice was something which had negative consequences for you. It's much easier to imagine that someone else told you to do this and therefore you are forced to do it, I guess.
I'm just following orders.
Yeah, exactly.
And now that we live in community and that we assign value to that, there's this sense of always wanting to fit in and not stand out. We're such herd animals, and living in community, it seems to feel more risky to stand out.
If you take a bit of a step back now, let's discuss if there are any problems that we see with autonomy. Are there any limits to it, for example?
The limitation to autonomy when you live in community is my face and your nose,
Yes.
right? Your autonomy has to somehow end where my autonomy begins. And I think about that in specific as an abortion provider, and people, as I struggle to secure access for women to make autonomous choices about reproduction and whether or not to enter motherhood, there's the notion that my willingness to provide that service, am I fully committed to autonomy if I have reservations about certain aspects of abortion care that feel like a violation of my conscience? And do I remain autonomous to refuse to provide that care when it feels like?
So we have a doctor I work with in Asia, and his perspective is very interesting. He calls himself a secular Christian, and he says his conscience actually does not allow him to deny an abortion to a woman. He says, how can the state law prevent me from helping save the woman's life when I know she needs a safe abortion?
Right.
And he says that's really the way he wants to articulate his objection. So I think that's an interesting one, because the entire conversation about conscientious objection is usually about doctors denying safe abortions to women, and he kind of wants to go the other way.
Yeah.
So I think maybe it's time to flip the argument and encourage doctors to be conscientious objectors for the sake of women.
What do we mean when we say that institutions don't have conscience? It's only individuals.
Having a conscience is one of the qualities of being a person. It's one thing to say that they may have a conscience from a legal point of view, but from a philosophical point of view, it's hard for me to see how they could have consciences. Because what it means to have a conscience is to have an internal dialogue, or to know yourself, or to consult the better angels of your nature, to use Lincoln's language. Corporations or institutions are abstractions that are not capable of those things. Now, individuals within institutions can have consciences, but I'm skeptical of the idea that institutions as a whole can have a conscience.
The concept of conscience and autonomy are important to me personally, because it is through listening to your own inner voice that you can begin to grapple and understand what is it that makes us human. How can we begin to understand the world around us? And most importantly, through the making of choices, you begin to understand what is good and what is bad, what is right and what is wrong. And I believe that it is through acting autonomously, through choice making, that you become aware of the moral foundations of your life. From what has been said up till now about the way that autonomy works in our society, from what everybody's saying, it does seem to be the case that we have a double standard. On the one hand, we have a very promiscuous attitude towards consumer choice. In other words, people can go shopping, they can buy everything, and people are told you got the right to choose. But we have a much more restrictive orientation towards moral choice. Is that roughly how it plays out in your minds?
Yeah, and I think a lot of the choices are limited not just by religion and morality, but also by the socio-cultural, political environment you are in. So I would imagine something like a reproductive choice would actually be very different for someone in China or India compared to someone in Europe or the US. And that may not necessarily be because they are less autonomous in terms of moral choices, but because choices don't take place in a vacuum.
I know cases in East Europe where, certainly my mother's generation, everybody my mother's generation would have abortion routinely. My mother had 5 or 6 abortions because that's what you did when you had no contraception.
Yeah.
And people just, to them this was like going for vaccination almost, and you might say, well, that's very frivolous or lighthearted, but in those circumstances, that was the choice you made in order to survive, in order to be who you wanted to be. And it might seem for us as, these people, 5 abortions, how could you possibly live with yourself under those circumstances? But these people were no less moral than people who have 12 children. It's not like a either-or situation.
The hierarchical church's discussion and positioning of reproductive choice makes women out in a very capitalist and consumerist way to be selfish, focused on their careers, wanting to have money, wanting to acquire things, that they don't want children because it would completely ruin their lavish Western lifestyle. And it's absolutely cruel and untrue to try to have a sort of intentional propaganda around that, to make women seem shallow and selfish and consumer about these choices.
Yeah, I mean, what you're describing is really the demoralization of choice, where morality becomes detached from choice, and choice is then repackaged as this narrow consumerist exercise. Why is it that that seems to be such a dominant mood at the moment? Because you hear it everywhere, in not just in relation to abortion or reproductive justice, but in all domains of human experience. I mean, what is really happening here that leads to this cheapening of the idea of choice?
Well, neoliberalism, I guess. The idea that everything is a market, and the market decides what is best for it, and therefore for the people who are involved in the market, I guess. So everything becomes a commodity, everyone's a consumer, everything has a price. So I think that's kind of the understanding that is seeping into everything else, not just the actual commercial market.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're just seen as consumers rather than as moral agents, kind of entering the market.
This is something that we have to be very conscious of, that people are being manipulated by the words that are applied to women when they exercise bodily autonomy, and they're not portrayed as moral agents that have any sort of dilemma or responsible choice to make for the good of themselves, their family, their community.
Certainly in my experience, the arguments that I hear against choice seems to be far more vociferous than those that kind of affirm it. And one of the arguments that you hear time and time again is that choice, well, it's meaningless because either I'm poor, I'm economically deprived, because I live in a bad neighborhood. I mean, there are a million different reasons as to why choice is not really a real moral or social accomplishment.
I think as a practicing doctor, I would also like to say that with my experience in the public sector hospitals, the assumption is often made that if someone is poor or illiterate or from the villages, they don't know enough to be able to think for themselves. So particularly in my part of the world, they will also accept and they will say, oh, look, you're the doctor, you tell me. What is the best contraception for me? Should I continue the pregnancy or not? Those kind of things. So the assumptions are repeatedly made that you need to take these decisions on behalf of someone else. And I think that creates a culture where even a concept like informed consent is very difficult, which is actually a process of ensuring autonomy.
The Catholic Church did a lot of original thinking about conscience and has some wonderful teaching about autonomy, conscience, and free will. And our tradition was never a series of absolute rules and orthodoxy tests, but it is now. I think really the reason that the official church, the hierarchical church, is worried and wants to de-emphasize our teaching on conscience and autonomy is because they are worried about preserving the institution of the Catholic Church. And they worry that emphasizing that individuals can discern for themselves and that we are going to question the hierarchy's rules and regulations is not good for their longevity and survival. In the last couple of generations, the church has lost the absolute hold on and power over people that they used to have in the past. And I think like all large, powerful, wealthy institutions, the hierarchy don't like losing this grip on power.
So when everything's been said and done, on balance, are you guys positive, neutral, pessimistic about the way ahead?
I would say long-term, I'm optimistic that there's always problems in the short run that could lead you to be pessimistic, but long-term, I think the world's becoming a better place.
One would have said it was mutually exclusive to have a LGBTQ identity and be a person of religious faith, let alone to be religious clergy, and here we are. I think on the same trajectory, at one day it's going to become for historical purposes only that we're going to be discussing that women had to wait a certain amount of period of time, that it wasn't funded, that all of the other mechanisms that are being used to deny women access to abortion decision making. I think the trajectory is going towards we're overcoming all of these social issues in ways that affirm human rights.
I'm also relatively positive about the future. I think so many very devout Catholics who say to me, I would never have an abortion, I don't condone abortion, but if a woman comes to me and says she has made that decision, I will walk with her and I will accompany her and I will stand in solidarity with her. And this, to me, is what being Catholic means, and it's not represented by this very small minority of men in the official church.
I think we need to recognize the fact that freedom of conscience and autonomy is really what sets us apart from the other animals on this planet. And unless we are able to fully explore our potential to exercise those freedoms, perhaps we will never really realize what it means to be fully human. So my vision for the future is that we all have the capacity and the right to do exactly that, because exercising the freedom of our conscience and autonomy is what will truly set us apart.